If I had known that the gift I bought to celebrate my parents-in-law's 40 years of marriage would end with me being told not to show up, I would never have believed that I had just gotten married. The car I bought for them was still parked right outside their house, polished, perfect, exactly where it was delivered that morning, and I was standing in the kitchen listening to my husband speak in the calmest voice I had ever heard him use. "They don't want you there." That was all he said. No explanation, no hesitation, no apology. The kettle was still boiling. The clock on the wall kept ticking. Outside, a neighbour was trimming their hedge, completely unaware that my marriage was quietly being dismantled. That day was meant to be a celebration, a garden full of guests, soft music, polite laughter. 40 years of loyalty and endurance. I had chosen the gift carefully, not to impress, not to compete, but to belong. I believed that when you married into a family, you earned your place. By giving, by supporting, by showing respect in the ways that mattered. What no one tells you is that sometimes, the more you give, the easier it becomes for people to decide that you are optional. When my husband told me not to come, he did not look uncomfortable. He looked relieved, as if removing me from the picture made the day run more smoothly. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an explanation. I simply stood there, holding my mug, realizing that something inside me had gone very quiet. That moment did not destroy me. It clarified everything. If you have ever been pushed aside politely, if you have ever been erased without a scene, if you have ever discovered that love had conditions you were never told about, then you will understand why this story unfolds the way it does. Before we continue, comment number 1 if you want to hear the full story, because what happened next was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was irreversible. I did not grow up imagining myself as someone who needed to be rescued. From the very beginning of my career, I learned how to stand on my own. I learned how to sit at long tables filled with men twice my age and speak without lowering my voice. I learned how to negotiate without apologizing, how to listen carefully, how to decide calmly. By my mid-30s, I was a senior manager at a financial group most people only read about in newspapers. Glass offices, quiet authority. Decisions that moved money across borders with a single signature. My days were structured. Early trains into the city. Meetings that began on time. Figures that had to make sense before emotions ever did. That was my world. Controlled. Predictable. Earned. I did not marry Daniel because I needed security. I already had that. I married him because I believed in partnership. He was kind in the beginning, soft-spoken, the sort of man who listened more than he spoke, the sort of man who made you believe that calmness was strength. When we talked about marriage, he said all the right things, about building a life together, about being equals, about finally feeling settled. And I believed him. I knew I earned more than he did. I knew my career moved faster, but that never frightened me. In my world, money was a tool, not a weapon. Not a measure of worth. When we bought our house, I paid the larger share without hesitation. When his work slowed down, I covered the gaps without comment. When his parents needed help, I offered it naturally. That is what partners do. They support. They adapt. They carry the weight together. What I did not realize was that somewhere along the way, my support stopped being appreciated and started being expected. It happened quietly, through small comments, small assumptions. You can handle it. You're better with numbers. It makes sense for you to take care of this. I told myself it was practical, that it was easier this way, that love did not need to be measured. I told myself I was choosing harmony. I was wrong. At work, people respected me because they knew what I was capable of. They listened when I spoke. They hesitated before challenging me. At home, my competence became invisible. I was no longer the woman who built her career from nothing. I was the woman who could afford things, the woman who would sort it out, the woman who would understand. I did understand, too well. I understood that Daniel avoided conflict, that he preferred peace, even if it came at my expense, that standing up for me meant standing up to his mother, and that was something he had never learned to do. I told myself that marriage meant compromise, that families took time, that patience was a virtue. So I softened myself. I spoke less. I let things slide. Not because I was weak, but because I was loyal. I believed that loyalty would eventually be recognized, that consistency would build trust, that generosity would be returned. I believed that love, given freely, would be honored. I did not see the shift until it was complete, until my presence became optional, until my voice was no longer required, until decisions were made about me, without me. The woman who negotiated contracts worth millions had quietly accepted being excluded from conversations at her own kitchen table. That contradiction should have frightened me. Instead, I told myself this was what commitment looked like. This was what marriage required. I did not know yet that this was not sacrifice. It was preparation. And the people who benefited from my silence had no intention of remembering what I had given. The first months of marriage felt calm in a way I had never experienced before. Not exciting, not overwhelming, just steady. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that I had arrived, that I no longer had to push, that I could finally rest inside something permanent. Daniel and I settled into routines quickly. Quiet mornings, evenings spent cooking simple meals, weekends planned a week in advance. There was comfort in knowing what came next. After years of deadlines and pressure, that predictability felt like safety. His parents were polite, careful, warm in the way English families often are when they are deciding how close to let you come. Margaret would smile and ask about my work. She would nod as if listening carefully. She would say things like, "You must be very busy," and "Daniel is lucky to have you." Nothing she said was unkind. His father would ask practical questions about traffic, about whether I found the commute manageable. They never raised their voices, never crossed boundaries openly, and that made it harder to notice what was missing. I mistook restraint for respect. Family dinners were calm, no arguments, no tension. But I was always aware of where I sat. Not physically, emotionally. I was included, but not consulted. Present, but not central. I told myself this was normal, that every family had its own rhythm, that closeness took time. Daniel seemed relieved during those gatherings, more relaxed than I had ever seen him. He laughed more, spoke less, let his mother guide conversations effortlessly. I watched him become someone softer in their presence, smaller. At the time, I found it endearing. I thought it meant he trusted me enough not to perform, that he felt safe enough to be himself. When decisions came up, they were framed as suggestions, gentle ones. "It might be easier if you handle this. Mum thinks it would make sense to do it this way." There was never an argument, just a quiet redirection. I agreed more often than I questioned, because nothing felt urgent, nothing felt threatening. We had just married. Surely this was the adjustment period everyone talked about. Friends congratulated me. They said I looked settled, grounded, and I believed them. I stopped questioning small discomforts, stopped trusting the instincts that had guided me for years. At work, I was precise, alert, always aware of shifting dynamics. At home, I relaxed that vigilance. I assumed love would protect me from imbalance. Margaret began offering help more frequently, organizing things, suggesting improvements, rearranging plans. I welcomed it. I thought it was kindness. She had been married for decades. What could I possibly know about family life that she did not? There were moments I felt myself fading slightly at the edges, but I ignored them. I had chosen this life, chosen this family, chosen to belong. And belonging, I believed, required patience. Daniel never disagreed with his parents in front of me. He did not contradict them. He smoothed over tension with silence. When I asked him later, privately, he would say, "It's not worth turning into a thing." And I accepted that, because things were peaceful, because nothing was visibly wrong, because I wanted this to work. That illusion of safety was convincing, dangerously so. It wrapped itself around me slowly, softly, until I no longer noticed how much space I had given away. Those months were not unhappy. That is what made them so deceptive. They felt like stability, like arrival, like the reward for years of effort. I did not realize that what I was experiencing was not security. It was accommodation. And the problem with accommodation is that once you offer it freely, people stop noticing that it costs you something. If you are still listening, comment the letter A below. Just the letter A, because what happened next would make it clear how fragile that sense of safety really was. Nothing changed all at once. That was the most unsettling part. If someone had raised their voice, I might have noticed sooner. If someone had said something openly cruel, I would have reacted. But everything happened in a polite tone, measured, reasonable. Margaret never told me what to do. She simply suggested. She would smile gently and say things like, "It might be easier if we do it this way," or "I've always found this works better for families." There was no accusation in her voice, no sharpness, just certainty. At first I appreciated it. She had decades of experience. She knew how things were done. When she rearranged plans, she did it quietly. When she changed details, she explained them calmly. When she corrected me, it was wrapped in concern. "I hope you don't mind. I just thought it would be simpler." Simplicity became her favorite word. What I did not realize was that simplicity always meant control. Daniel never contradicted her, not once. If she suggested something, he agreed. If she questioned a decision, he softened immediately. Sometimes he would glance at me first, as if checking whether I would object. When I did not, he relaxed. It took me longer than it should have to understand that my silence was being interpreted as permission. Small moments began to stand out. Margaret would ask Daniel questions she could easily have asked me. She would discuss plans with him directly, even when they involved me. I would be present, listening, smiling, invisible. When I gently pointed it out later, Daniel would say, "She doesn't mean anything by it. That's just how she is." There was always an explanation, never a boundary. At family dinners, decisions were framed as collective agreements, but I noticed how quickly consensus formed before I spoke. "Everyone thinks this makes sense. Mum feels strongly about this." I learned that by the time a decision reached me, it had already been made. Margaret's kindness was consistent. So was her authority. She remembered birthdays. She sent thoughtful messages. She praised me in public. But in private, she guided, redirected, reframed. "I worry that you work too hard. I just don't want you to feel overwhelmed." She never questioned my competence. She questioned my endurance, and Daniel echoed her concerns. "Maybe you should slow down. Mum thinks you're pushing yourself." He said it as if he was protecting me, as if stepping back was for my own good. What he never said was, "I trust you. I support you. I will stand with you." He avoided tension instinctively. If a situation felt uncomfortable, he smoothed it over. If his mother frowned, he adjusted. If I hesitated, he reassured her. He believed neutrality was kindness. He did not see how often neutrality sided against me. The comments were never harsh. That was their power. "You're very capable. You can manage this. It's easier for you. Each sentence sounded like a compliment. Each one carried an assumption that my role was to adapt, to absorb, to make things work quietly. At work, when someone spoke like that, I recognized the tactic immediately. It was how authority shifted without confrontation. At home, I dismissed it. I told myself families were different, that emotions complicated things, that logic did not always apply. But patterns do not disappear just because we choose not to see them. Margaret began consulting Daniel about finances casually, not asking, mentioning. Daniel knows about these things. Daniel can explain it better. He could not, but he nodded anyway. He would look to me later, uncertain. As if hoping I would fix it without making him choose. And I did, because it was easier, because it avoided conflict. Every time I stepped in silently, the structure solidified. Margaret did not need to exclude me openly. She only needed to let me volunteer my absence. Daniel did not betray me loudly. He did it by stepping back, by choosing comfort over clarity, by choosing peace over partnership. The household remained calm. No arguments, no raised voices. On the surface it looked functional, but underneath something was shifting. Authority was being redistributed. Responsibility was being reassigned. And my position was being quietly downgraded. No one announced it. No one acknowledged it. That is how these things survive. I felt the discomfort long before I named it. A tightening in my chest during conversations. A pause before speaking. I began choosing my words carefully, not to offend, not to disrupt. The woman who negotiated complex deals without hesitation now hesitated before expressing an opinion at dinner. That contrast should have alarmed me. Instead, I rationalized it. I told myself that love required patience, that blending families took time, that being accommodating was mature. Margaret remained pleasant. Daniel remained calm. No one appeared to be the villain. And yet I was slowly being positioned as the problem, not through blame, but through expectation, the expectation that I would adjust, that I would understand, that I would not insist, that I would not push. And because everything was polite, because nothing was overt, because no one ever raised their voice, it took me far too long to realize that this was not harmony. It was erasure in a civil tone. The first sign did not feel dramatic. It barely felt like anything at all. I was passing the study one evening, carrying a glass of water, when I heard Daniel lower his voice, not whispering, just quieter than usual. I slowed down without meaning to. "I know," he said, a pause. "Yes." After that, I stood still, the carpet soft under my feet, the house otherwise silent. There was nothing alarming in his tone, no urgency, no tension. That was what unsettled me. When I asked him later who he had been speaking to, he answered easily, "Just Mum." I nodded, accepted it. There was no reason not to. A few days later, I noticed him checking his phone more often. Not constantly, just enough for it to register. He would glance at the screen and tilt it away slightly, not hiding it, just angling it. When I asked if everything was all right, he smiled. Work stuff. He had never called his work that. I let it go. Margaret began sending messages more frequently. Not to me, to Daniel. I knew because he mentioned it casually. Mum was just saying something earlier. Mum thinks this might be better. He stopped including me in the messages themselves, just the conclusions. At dinners, Margaret's questions shifted. Less about me, more about logistics, timing, arrangements, who would be where. It sounded practical, almost boring. But I noticed how often Daniel answered for both of us. That should be fine. We can manage that. I watched conversations happen around me, about plans that involved me, about decisions that affected me. And no one asked for my input. I told myself I was imagining patterns that were not there, that I was tired, overthinking. At work, if I had sensed this kind of movement, I would have paid attention immediately. But at home, I resisted that instinct. One evening, as Daniel stepped into the garden to take a call, I caught a fragment of a sentence through the open door. "She doesn't need to know yet." The words landed softly, almost carelessly. I did not move. I did not breathe. When he came back inside, I was sitting exactly where I had been before, my expression unchanged. He smiled, asked if I wanted tea. I said yes. That night I lay awake longer than usual, not anxious, just alert. The next morning, a message appeared on Daniel's phone while it was charging on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up briefly. I did not read it. I saw only the first line. "Once everything is sorted..." The rest disappeared as the screen went dark. I turned away, told myself privacy mattered. Margaret invited us for lunch the following weekend. Her message was warm, friendly, perfectly normal. Daniel replied immediately. He did not ask me first. "She's looking forward to seeing us," he said. Us again. At lunch, Margaret spoke more than usual, guiding the conversation, setting expectations. She mentioned dates, milestones, a celebration coming up. Her eyes flicked to Daniel as she spoke, not to me. Daniel nodded at the right moments, answered before questions were fully formed. I smiled, listened, said very little. No one was rude. No one was dismissive. And yet, I felt like a guest at my own table. Later that afternoon, I overheard Margaret on the phone in the hallway. Her voice was calm, measured. "Yes, that's already taken care of." A pause. "Daniel understands." I could have stepped forward, announced myself, made my presence known. I chose not to. Something in me wanted to see how far this would go. Daniel became more distracted in the days that followed, more agreeable, eager to keep things smooth. If I asked a question, he reassured me quickly. "If anything comes up, I'll tell you." But nothing ever came up, not officially. Plans were made quietly, messages exchanged privately, decisions settled elsewhere. I noticed how often the phrase, "after that," appeared. In conversations, in messages, in half-finished thoughts. After that. It hovered in the air, undefined, unexplained. I stopped asking questions. Not because I trusted the situation, but because I wanted to understand it fully. There is a difference between ignorance and observation. I began paying attention to timing, to glances, to silences that lasted a second too long. I noticed how Daniel's shoulders relaxed after certain calls, how Margaret smiled slightly when he agreed without hesitation. No one ever sat me down. No one explained anything. That was the point. Whatever was being planned did not require my consent, only my absence. And the most unsettling realization was this: they were not rushing. They were confident. If you are still listening, comment the number 5 below. Just the number 5, because what I discovered next confirmed that this was not confusion. It was coordination. The morning it happened felt ordinary. That was what made it unbearable. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I was anxious, just alert. The house was quiet. Daniel was already awake. I could hear movement downstairs. The familiar sounds of a normal morning. The kettle, a cupboard opening and closing. I stood in front of the wardrobe, choosing what to wear. Nothing dramatic, nothing attention-seeking, just appropriate. That day mattered. Not to me, but to the family I had married into. 40 years of marriage, a celebration of endurance, of loyalty, of staying. I moved through the house carefully, as if trying not to disturb something fragile. Daniel was standing in the kitchen when I came down, fully dressed, calm, too calm. He did not look up immediately. He poured water into a mug, stirred it, set it down. Then he turned to me. "They don't want you to come." That was it. No build-up. No explanation, just a sentence delivered with the same tone he used to discuss weather or traffic. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. "Who doesn't want me to come?" he exhaled, not impatiently, not kindly, just tired. "Mum thinks it would be better this way." Better. The word settled between us. I waited. For clarification. For something that would make it make sense. Nothing came. The kettle clicked off. The silence stretched. "Why?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. He looked at the floor, then back at me. "It's just easier. Easier. Not kinder. Not fairer. Easier." I felt something shift inside my chest. Not breaking. Detaching. I looked past him, through the kitchen window. The car was already there, parked neatly outside his parents' house across the street. The gift I had chosen. Paid for. Arranged. Ready. "Do they know I bought it?" I asked. Daniel hesitated, a fraction too long. "Yes." "And they still don't want me there?" He nodded. I waited for him to say more, to defend me, to argue, to soften it. He did not. "They don't want things to feel awkward," he said finally. Awkward. That was what I had become. Not a wife, not family, an inconvenience. I thought of the months I had spent adjusting, the dinners, the silence, the patience. I realized then that none of it had been enough, because it had never been about effort. It had been about position. I stood very still. The mug in my hand had gone cold. Daniel shifted his weight slightly. Uncomfortable. "I'll explain it to them," he added, "as long as everything goes smoothly." Smoothly. The word echoed. I saw it then, clearly, sharp and undeniable. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a decision, made without me, finalized without my voice, delivered to me as a courtesy. I nodded slowly. "All right," I said. Daniel looked relieved, as if I had done the right thing, as if compliance was the correct response. I walked upstairs without another word, closed the bedroom door, sat on the edge of the bed. The house felt unfamiliar, like somewhere I no longer belonged. I did not cry. Not then. What hurt was not the exclusion. It was the certainty behind it. The knowledge that I had been removed from the picture deliberately, cleanly, without debate. Families argue, they disagree, they negotiate. This family erased. I stared at my reflection, at the woman who had built her life with precision, who understood systems, who recognized patterns. And suddenly, everything made sense. The messages, the silence, the planning. This was what, after that, had meant. I took a breath, slow, measured. The pain was sharp, but it was contained, because something else had replaced it. Clarity. That morning did not end my marriage. It revealed it. And once something is revealed, you cannot pretend you did not see it. That was the moment I stopped trying to belong, and the moment I began preparing to leave. I did not cry after that morning, not because it did not hurt, but because crying would have required confusion. And I was no longer confused. I sat in the bedroom for a long time, listening to the house settle. The distant sound of a car door closing, footsteps outside, life continuing as if nothing significant had happened. That was when I understood something important. Pain demands answers. Clarity does not. I stood up slowly, folded the clothes I had chosen, put them back into the wardrobe with care, not angrily, not dramatically, methodically. At work, when something failed, I never reacted immediately. I observed. I assessed. I calculated impact. That instinct returned to me fully in that moment. I went downstairs and poured myself a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table where I had so often stayed quiet, where decisions had been made around me. This time, I did not feel small. I felt precise. I replayed the morning in my head, not emotionally, but structurally. The wording, the pauses, the relief on Daniel's face when I agreed. Relief always reveals where loyalty lies. I realized that nothing about this had been spontaneous. It had been prepared, discussed, agreed upon. I had not been excluded because of a mistake. I had been excluded because I was no longer necessary. That thought did not break me. It sharpened me. I stopped thinking in terms of marriage, of feelings, of fairness. I started thinking in terms of systems. Who benefited? Who decided? Who relied on what? When you remove emotion, patterns become obvious. Daniel avoided conflict. Margaret controlled outcomes. And I had been financing stability while being slowly sidelined. That was not cruelty. It was efficiency. And efficiency always leaves evidence. I opened my laptop, not to send messages, not to confront anyone, to look. Accounts, agreements, names on documents, things I had signed automatically, things I had assumed were shared, things I had never needed to question before. I did not feel panic. I felt focus. At work. This was the moment I enjoyed most. When a situation stopped being personal and started being solvable. I noticed how much I had protected others by staying silent. How many assumptions had been made in my favor? How many decisions depended on my continued cooperation? They had mistaken my restraint for permanence. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand explanations. I did not announce anything. Because announcements invite resistance. Silence invites underestimation. I moved through the house calmly, collected my thoughts, made tea, cleaned the counter, normal actions, deliberate pace. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. I no longer needed to be included. I needed to be accurate. The woman who negotiated contracts worth millions had returned. Not angry, not vengeful, clear. I understood now that I had never been powerless. I had simply chosen not to use power where it felt inappropriate. But power does not disappear because you refuse to acknowledge it. It waits. I thought about the celebration happening without me, the guests, the smiles, the assumptions, and for the first time I did not feel excluded. I felt detached. Detachment is not numbness. It is perspective. I saw the situation for what it was, a structure built on access to me, to my resources, to my compliance. Structures collapse quietly when access is removed. I closed my laptop, stood up, looked around the kitchen one last time. The room looked the same. I did not. That morning marked the end of something, not my marriage. That had already been decided without me. It marked the end of my participation. From that point on, every action I took would be intentional, measured, legal. I was no longer trying to belong. I was preparing to exit. And exits, when planned properly, do not require noise. They require timing. I had time, and I intended to use it. I did not act immediately. That silence was intentional. When people expect anger and receive none, they grow careless. They assume delay means doubt. They assume calm means hesitation. I let them believe that. In the hours after I was told not to attend, I did nothing visible. No messages, no phone calls, no confrontation. From the outside, it looked like acceptance. Inside, it was assessment. I treated my own marriage the way I would treat a failing acquisition, without sentiment, without nostalgia. I asked myself questions I had trained for years to ask. Who benefits from the current structure? Who carries the risk? Who assumes stability will continue? And what happens if that assumption is removed? I wrote everything down: accounts, assets, legal responsibility, social exposure, and again, the same detail surfaced. The car. It had never been my idea. Weeks earlier, during one of those carefully polite lunches, Margaret had introduced it the way experienced people always introduce desire. Indirectly. She had not looked at me when she mentioned it. She had looked into her cup. "We saw that model the other day," she said lightly. "Such a beautiful car. Of course, completely unnecessary for us. She smiled. A small one, measured. Daniel laughed immediately. His father dismissed it with a wave of his hand. But no one changed the subject. The idea remained, unclaimed, waiting. Later that evening, Daniel mentioned it again while we were alone. Mum was just making conversation. But imagine how pleased they'd be. I remember the way he said it, casual, almost hopeful. I did not hear manipulation. I heard an opportunity to close distance. I imagined appreciation. I imagined warmth. I imagined that generosity would finally remove the invisible line I kept bumping into. So I paid for it. I did not negotiate. I did not delay. I arranged everything efficiently. The paperwork was clean. The payment cleared immediately. I believed generosity would confirm belonging. Instead, generosity confirmed something else. Once the car was secured, my presence became optional. That was the sequence. Not coincidence, sequence. Understanding that changed my posture entirely. The first correction was financial, not dramatic, not visible at first. I contacted my bank early that morning, before the celebration, before the speeches, before anyone realized what was coming. I removed every secondary access linked to my accounts, not out of spite, out of accuracy. Cards. Standing authorizations. Automatic permissions set up during what I thought was partnership. Everything reverted to its original state. Ownership restored, nothing more. Daniel discovered this that evening. From his perspective, it was humiliating. He was sitting opposite his parents in a restaurant, the mood celebratory, relaxed. He reached for the card without thinking, because he had not had to think for months. The waiter returned quietly, professional, apologetic. There appears to be an issue. Daniel laughed it off, tried again. Same result. He excused himself, stepped outside, called me. I watched my phone light up on the table. I let it ring. From his point of view, this was sudden, embarrassing, unfair. From mine, it was overdue. Money had left my account smoothly for months, covering comfort, smoothing over imbalance, maintaining an illusion of shared stability. All I had done was stop pretending. The second correction involved assets. This one required precision. The house we lived in was always described as ours, referred to that way, spoken about socially that way. But legal language does not care about social habits. The deed was in my name. The mortgage depended on my income. The liability was mine. I had agreed to that structure because it was efficient, not because I had relinquished control. My solicitor already had everything prepared. Nothing rushed. Nothing improvised. One email. Clear. Neutral. By the time the celebration reached its formal speeches, notifications were already moving through the appropriate channels. Nothing changed visibly at first. That was deliberate. Power is most effective when it precedes awareness. And then there was the car, the centerpiece, the object around which everything had quietly rotated. It arrived that morning exactly as arranged. Polished, immaculate, parked prominently outside their house. From Margaret's point of view, it was validation. Guests admired it openly. Neighbours slowed down. Photos were taken. She positioned herself close to it, too close, as if standing beside something long enough could establish entitlement. What she misunderstood was that ownership is not emotional. It is documented. The registration was in my name. The insurance was in my name. The payment had left my account. Late in the afternoon, when champagne glasses were being refilled and conversations grew louder, a recovery vehicle arrived. No sirens. No spectacle. Two men stepped out, courteous, unhurried. They checked the registration, made a call, waited. Margaret noticed first. Confusion crossed her face, then a polite smile, then a question that did not quite land. Daniel reacted next, immediate, panicked. He stepped forward, tried to explain, tried to assert authority he did not possess. From his father's perspective, it felt unreal. A misunderstanding, surely something administrative. The car was loaded calmly, efficiently, without argument. Guests watched. Whispers moved faster than information. The gift they had hinted at, the gift they had admired, the gift they had accepted, left, and I was still not there. That moment was not cruel. It was precise. The third correction was reputational. Absence creates curiosity, not clarity. So I sent a card, simple, elegant. Delivered with the remaining gifts, inside, one sentence. The most valuable gift I have given you is the truth. No signature, no explanation. From Margaret's perspective, it was devastating, not because of the words, but because of the audience. Questions followed, soft, careful, persistent. Daniel attempted to answer. He could not, because explanations require coherence, and coherence requires consent. That evening, Daniel returned home furious. Accusations, emotion, noise. I listened. When he finished, I said one sentence. This is what happens when decisions are made without me. He had nothing to counter that. Margaret called later, controlled, measured. She spoke about family, about misunderstanding, about intention. I listened. Then I replied calmly. You suggested the car? I paid for it. You accepted it. And then you decided I was not welcome. Silence followed. Facts do not escalate, they conclude. I did not celebrate their discomfort. I did not feel triumphant. What I felt was balance returning to a system that had relied on my silence. I had not taken anything that was not mine. I had simply withdrawn access. That night, I slept deeply, not because I had won, but because confusion was gone. If you are still listening, comment the number 8 below, just the number 8, because what came next was not revenge. It was inevitability. They did not come to talk. They came to regain control. That difference mattered. Daniel arrived first. Not calmly, not thoughtfully. He opened the door too hard. Let it close behind him with unnecessary force. His voice filled the room before his coat was even off. You didn't have to do that. You made everyone look stupid. You've ruined everything. I stayed seated. I did not look at him immediately. I waited for the noise to peak. He paced, ran a hand through his hair, repeated himself. You embarrassed my parents. You humiliated me in front of everyone. I let him finish. When silence finally appeared, awkward and incomplete, I spoke. This happened because you made decisions without me. He laughed. Not because it was funny, because laughter felt safer than reflection. It was one day. It was supposed to be simple. I looked up at him then. It was months. That landed differently. He stopped pacing. His expression shifted. Defensive now. You're exaggerating. I shook my head once. I'm being precise. That word unsettled him, because precision had always been my strength. He tried a different angle, softer, more reasonable. You could have talked to me. You didn't have to go nuclear, I answered calmly. I did talk. You chose silence. The room went quiet again. He stepped closer, lowered his voice. We're married. We're supposed to be a team. I met his eyes. A team does not decide who is optional. That was the moment he understood something had changed. He grew louder again, anger resurfacing. You think money makes you powerful? I waited, then replied, no. Clarity does. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked away. Margaret called next. Not immediately. She waited, calculated. Her voice was controlled, polite, carefully shaped. She spoke about family values, about misunderstanding, about how things had been taken the wrong way. I let her speak uninterrupted. When she paused, expecting reassurance, I said 4 sentences. You suggested the car. I paid for it. You accepted it. And then you decided I was not welcome. She objected. gently at first. "That's not fair," I responded. "It is accurate." Her tone sharpened. "You've always been difficult." "You don't understand how families work," I answered. "Families do not erase people quietly." That cracked her composure. She raised her voice, just slightly. "You went too far," I replied. "I stopped pretending." There was silence on the line, heavy, uncomfortable. She tried again, this time emotional. "Daniel is falling apart," I responded, because he relied on stability he did not maintain. She said my name, slowly, as if invoking authority. I did not respond. Authority had shifted. She felt it. That was why she was calling. Later that night, Daniel returned. Not angry this time. Unravelled. He sat, head in his hands, voice low. "We can still fix this." I stood, picked up my keys. "Not everything broken is meant to be repaired." He looked up. "You're throwing away our marriage." I answered without hesitation. "It ended when you decided I was optional." He stood in my path, not aggressively, desperately. "You're cold." I met his gaze. "I'm clear." That was the difference. I left, no shouting, no final argument, no dramatic exit. Because power does not announce itself. It moves. From that moment on, conversations shifted. They asked questions. I answered selectively. They demanded explanations. I declined. They raised their voices. I did not. Every interaction confirmed the same truth. They needed closure. I did not. The final message I received from Margaret came days later. "We should talk." I did not reply, not because I was angry, but because nothing remained unresolved on my side. When you speak only what is necessary, your words stop being negotiable. I had said everything that mattered. The rest was noise, and I was finished listening. The silence that followed lasted longer than I expected. Days passed. No messages, no apologies, no explanations. That was when panic began to replace anger. Daniel called again, not shouting this time, not accusing. Careful. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was lower, unsteady. I did not answer immediately. Silence has a way of forcing honesty. When I finally agreed to meet him, it was brief, public, neutral. He arrived early, sat already waiting. His posture was different, shoulders forward, hands clasped. This was not confrontation. This was damage control. "You didn't have to make it this final," he said quietly. I replied. "It was already final." He frowned, confused. "I thought you just needed time." I looked at him. I needed clarity. And I got it. He tried another approach. Guilt. "My parents are struggling." "Mum hasn't been sleeping," I answered. "They made their choices while I was excluded." His jaw tightened. "You're punishing them." I shook my head once. "I'm no longer protecting them." That distinction unsettled him. He leaned forward. "We're losing everything." I replied calmly. "You lost access." "That's not the same thing." He went quiet, then asked the question he had been avoiding. "Is there anything I can do?" I answered honestly. "You could have done it already." He stared at the table, nodded slowly. Later that evening, Margaret tried again. This time, her voice was different, not controlled, not polite, tired. "We never meant to hurt you," she said. I listened. "You misunderstand our intentions," I replied. "Intentions don't erase outcomes." She exhaled sharply. "You've always been independent." "We thought you didn't need reassurance," I answered. "Then you shouldn't have relied on my silence." Her voice cracked. "You're tearing this family apart," I responded. "No." I stopped holding it together. That was the moment her tone changed again, sharper, defensive. "You think you're better than us," I paused, then spoke. "I think I'm finished explaining myself." The line went quiet. That was the last real conversation we had. After that, communication became logistical, cold, necessary only when required. There were no more arguments, No dramatic closures. Because closure does not come from agreement, it comes from acceptance. They did not accept it quickly, but they adapted, and I did not wait to see how. I had already moved on. Karma did not arrive with drama. It arrived with time. In the weeks that followed, nothing exploded. No scandals, no public scenes. That was the mistake they kept making. They expected a reaction, a counterattack, noise. What they did not expect was absence. Without my involvement, small systems began to fail, quietly, incrementally. Daniel struggled first. Bills that had once been paid without thought now required attention. Deadlines were missed. Conversations with banks became longer, less confident. At work, he appeared distracted, uncertain. The calm he relied on no longer held. People noticed, not because he failed spectacularly, but because he hesitated. Hesitation travels faster than mistakes. Margaret attempted to compensate. She offered advice, suggestions, control. But control only works when someone accepts it. Without access to my resources, her authority lost weight. Plans had to be adjusted, promises revised. She grew frustrated, short-tempered, less composed. The family dynamic shifted. Conversations became tense. Blame began circulating. Daniel blamed pressure. Margaret blamed misunderstanding. His father withdrew completely. No one took responsibility. They turned inward instead. From the outside, it looked like stress. Normal stress. From within, it was something else. A structure collapsing under its own assumptions. They had built a life that depended on my quiet support. When that support disappeared, the imbalance revealed itself. There were moments I heard about second-hand. Arguments over money, accusations over decisions, silence where reassurance used to be. They began to resent each other for what they had lost, and none of them could name it. That is how karma works when it is not theatrical. It mirrors behavior. It removes insulation. Margaret called once more, not to argue, to negotiate. Her tone was softer, less certain. "We have always thought of you as family," she said. I listened, then replied, "Family does not remove people when they become inconvenient." She did not respond. Daniel sent messages, apologies that arrived too late, explanations that explained nothing. I didn't realize. I never meant it to go this far. I did not reply, because intention does not undo consequence. Over time, the narrative around them changed. Friends asked questions, not directly, carefully. Why had the gift disappeared? Why had I not attended? Why things felt strained? They offered vague answers, shifted topics. Uncertainty replaced confidence, and uncertainty, once introduced, lingers. Meanwhile, my life simplified. Without managing their needs, my energy returned to me. My focus sharpened. My days grew quieter. I moved through work with ease. Clarity always returns when emotional noise is removed. There was no triumph in watching their difficulties, only confirmation. I had not caused their problems. I had simply stopped preventing them. That distinction mattered. Daniel attempted one final conversation weeks later. Calm, careful. "We're falling apart," he said. I responded, "You were stable because I held things together." Silence followed. He asked if there was any chance of fixing it. I answered honestly, "You cannot repair something you never respected." That was the last real exchange we had. After that, communication faded. Margaret withdrew completely. Her messages stopped, not out of pride, out of defeat. She no longer had leverage, and without leverage, control loses purpose. The family did not implode, they dissolved, slowly, uneventfully, the way many things end when they are no longer supported. What remained was not devastation, it was consequence. I did not punish them, I did not seek retribution. I stepped aside and allowed reality to operate. That was enough. Karma does not require cruelty. It requires accuracy. When people lose what they took for granted, they often destroy each other searching for a replacement. I did not watch closely. I did not need to, because my chapter with them was already closed. Time did the rest, not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently. Weeks passed and small cracks became patterns. Daniel began missing things, not important things, ordinary things, appointments, emails, deadlines that once seemed automatic. At work, he stopped volunteering opinions. He waited to be asked, then answered cautiously. People noticed the hesitation. They always do. Confidence does not vanish overnight. It leaks. Margaret tried to regain structure. She reorganized schedules, offered advice no one requested, inserted herself into decisions that no longer required her input. But without leverage, control turns into noise. People listened less, agreed more slowly, stopped checking in. She felt it. The loss of gravity. Conversations inside the family grew strained, shorter, sharper. Daniel blamed stress. Margaret blamed misunderstanding. His father retreated completely. Meals became quieter, then separate, then irregular. No one said anything directly. They did not have to. The system that had relied on my quiet involvement was now running without its stabilizer. It wobbled. Financially, adjustments became unavoidable. Plans were revised. Promises softened. Nothing collapsed. But nothing expanded either. Stagnation replaced momentum. Friends began asking careful questions, not accusations, observations. Why I had stepped back. Why things felt tense, why celebrations no longer felt celebratory. Answers were vague, inconsistent, stories shifted depending on who was listening. That inconsistency stayed. Reputations do not fall from single events. They erode through contradiction. Meanwhile, my life became noticeably quieter, not emptier, quieter. Without managing emotional volatility, my focus returned to its natural state. Workdays shortened. Evenings felt longer. Rest came easier. I did not check messages compulsively. I did not anticipate reactions. I slept without replaying conversations. That calm was not relief. It was alignment. Daniel reached out again after several months, not to argue, not to accuse, to update. Things were difficult. He was tired. Nothing seemed to be working. I listened, then said nothing, because some updates do not require responses. Margaret stopped calling altogether. Her messages faded into silence, not out of pride, out of resignation. She had exhausted every angle, control, appeal, emotion. None restored what had shifted. That was the true consequence, not loss, but irrelevance. The family did not implode. They adjusted downward. Fewer gatherings, smaller plans, lower expectations. The future became something to manage, not something to look forward to. I was not part of that recalibration, and I did not need to be. Karma does not punish. It recalibrates. It removes what was taken for granted and leaves people to deal with the structure they built. I did not monitor their decline. I did not need updates, because my life was no longer entangled with theirs, and detachment is the cleanest form of justice. If you are still listening, comment the number 10 below, just the number 10, because what comes next is not about consequence, it is about freedom. Freedom did not arrive all at once. It arrived quietly, in ordinary moments, in the absence of noise. My life did not transform overnight. There were no dramatic relocations, no public announcements. What changed was smaller and far more permanent. Mornings became slower. I woke without rehearsing conversations in my head. Without checking messages, I did not want to read. I chose my clothes without considering how they might be interpreted. I planned my days without adjusting them around someone else's expectations. Work remained demanding, but it felt lighter. Because for the first time in a long while, all of my energy was directed forward, not sideways. I noticed how much space silence created when it was no longer filled with tension, how clarity feels when it is not constantly negotiated. There were evenings I spent alone, not because I was isolated, but because I was at ease. That distinction matters. Freedom is often misunderstood as escape, as distance, as separation. But real freedom is alignment. It is waking up without having to justify your presence. It is choosing without bracing for consequence. It is knowing that your value does not depend on how quietly you endure. I stopped explaining my decisions, not because I became secretive, but because explanation was no longer required. The people who needed control lost interest when there was nothing left to manage, and that absence felt like peace. There were moments I reflected on what had happened, not with anger, not with regret, with understanding. I understood now that loyalty without boundaries is not devotion. It is erosion. That generosity without respect is not kindness. It is permission. And that love which requires self-removal is not love at all. The hardest part was not leaving. It was recognizing how long I had stayed after I should have moved. But that recognition did not bring shame. It brought clarity. I did not lose a family. I reclaimed myself. Life continued to expand in quiet ways. New routines, new rhythms, a steadiness that did not require performance. People around me adjusted. Some drifted, some remained. I learned that connection built on mutual respect does not need constant reassurance. It holds. There was no final message, no closure speech, because closure is not something you receive. It is something you choose. I chose not to reopen doors that had required me to shrink to fit. And in that choice, I gained something far more valuable than approval. I gained ownership of my time, of my decisions, of my silence. Sometimes, the most expensive thing you gain is freedom. If this story resonated with you, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stayed quiet to keep peace, only to realize it cost you your place? And if you could choose again, would you stay or would you walk away? Tell me in the comments. Your story might help someone else find their clarity, and if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, about choosing yourself without noise, then stay with this channel. Because freedom does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives when you finally stop explaining. There is a strange moment that comes after everything ends. Not relief, not happiness, but space. Space to notice who you are when no one is demanding proof. Space to hear your own thoughts without interruption. Space to sit with silence and realize it is no longer threatening. For a long time, I believed strength meant endurance, holding things together, absorbing discomfort so others could remain comfortable. I know now that strength can also look like release, like choosing not to answer, like letting people misunderstand you, like allowing an ending to stay ended. I did not rebuild my life to impress anyone. I rebuilt it so I could breathe inside it. There are still days that are difficult, still moments when old habits surface, the instinct to explain, to smooth, to minimize. But those moments pass more quickly now, because I remember this. Peace does not require permission, and dignity does not require an audience. If you are listening to this and something feels familiar, if you recognize the quiet exhaustion of being tolerated rather than chosen, I want you to know this. You are not too much. You are not difficult. You are not asking for too much. You are simply asking to exist without being erased, and that is never unreasonable. So here is my final thought. Sometimes walking away is not giving up. It is refusing to disappear slowly. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. One word is enough. Stay or leave. Because your answer matters.